So what I wanted to announce today is Ploughshares Fund's new $1 million Women's Initiative campaign. What we're trying to do is to raise funds specifically to support women-led initiatives, really to address this age-old problem of women being severely underrepresented in all the important discussions, in the decision-making that goes on throughout the field, this field as well as many others.
That's the voice of former ambassador to the United Nations in Geneva and current Ploughshares Fund board member, Pamela Hamamoto. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. But first, here are your co-hosts, Joe Cirincione and Michelle Dover.
Welcome back. This is the 48th episode of Press the Button. It's a beautiful spring-like week here in Washington, D.C., and I'm here with Michelle Dover.
And speaking of weeks, we are also celebrating International Women's Day week, which started Sunday.
Is that a thing?
I'm not sure, but I think it is.
What do you have for us in the news this week?
So in early warning, we'll be looking at the recent IAEA reports about Iran and looking at where the two Democratic frontrunners stand on nuclear issues. For our question, we have one from one of our listeners in Massachusetts.
Yay! I lived up there for many years, you know.
Yeah, so you've said.
Okay. And then Michelle and I interview Ambassador Pam Hamamoto. She's on our board. And when we went out last week to Ploughshares Fund headquarters in San Francisco, we sat down with her and talked about her time as the U.S. ambassador in Geneva, where she started an organization called International Gender Champions, the inspiration for our gender champions in nuclear policy. She talks to us about the Women's Initiative that we are launching this week at Ploughshares Fund.
Yes. Pam is co-leading our campaign to raise $1 million towards this work.
I think you're going to love this interview.
But as always, if you like what you hear, give us a rating, a review, or a share. We need your help to spread the word about this podcast. Your friends listen to you when they ask what they should be listening to.
We're packed a lot into this episode, and the clock is ticking. Let's go.
And now, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Dal. Today I'm joined by two fellow Ploughshares Fund staff, Akshai Vikram, Hale Fellow, and Tom Collina, Director of Policy. Welcome back.
Thanks for having us.
So as you know, we have 7 minutes to cover the world's nuclear news, and our time starts now. Akshai, last week we saw the U.S. Democratic presidential candidate field narrow to two, former Vice President Joe Biden and Senator Bernie Sanders. Do we know where these candidates stand on nuclear policy?
I mean, what a difference a week makes, Michelle. It's been a lot easier to track just two candidates than the 12 or 15 I had originally when I started at Ploughshares.
Too real.
I would say that now it's a two-man race, and the good news is they agree with each other and they agree with the American people on a lot of nuclear issues. They both are skeptical of Trump's new nuclear weapon. They both want the United States to re-enter nuclear agreements like the Iran nuclear deal, and they both want to extend the New START agreement. I do think that there are some disagreements between the two of them. North Korea policy is an issue area where they seem to have diverged from each other quite a bit, and their rhetorical tact is pretty different when it comes to that issue in particular. However, I do think that there is both of them seem to be willing to go beyond what Obama did on nuclear weapons issues. Bernie Sanders has been pretty outspoken about that in the Senate, but I also think it's important to remember that Joe Biden has supported arms control throughout his career, both as a senator and as vice president, and he was pushing for a no first use policy in the last days of the Obama administration. So he might surprise us if he does become elected president.
I would just add to that that I think Biden is more of a incremental reformer on nuclear policy, and he'll take us in a good direction, which is great. Senator Sanders is probably more structural, dynamic, more forward-leaning reformer of the system. So, for example, if we were looking forward to someone coming in and dramatically reducing defense spending and forcing a constriction of the nuclear modernization program, for example, and possibly canceling the new ICBM program, Sanders is probably more likely to take a forward-leaning structural approach like that than Biden, but we'll see.
Do we know how much political capital either of them would be willing to spend on these issues?
Well, one question is who would come in and be willing to just do stuff, right? Because what we see with President Trump is even if his cabinet doesn't necessarily agree with him, he just gets it done. And I'm not saying all of those situations were good, but it is a model that the next president might choose to follow. Sanders might be more willing to do that than Biden. We shall see. But certainly President Obama was in the mold of consult with my cabinet secretaries, build consensus, move forward. We saw that in a number of situations on nuclear policy that didn't serve him well. So we'll see if it's Biden, does he follow that same model? If it's Sanders, does he do a different model?
Akshay, you mentioned that these candidates are in step with what the American public thinks. What is it that the American public thinks?
So the Union of Concerned Scientists has some great polling about this that you can check out on their website. But the American public is largely in support of a lot of common sense reforms to nuclear policy, supporting the no first use policy, that the United States would never start a nuclear war, reining in nuclear spending, extending arms control agreements is popular both with Democratic and Republican voters. So things like that, especially including diplomacy with Iran, are things that they are in agreement with the American public on.
Speaking of Iran, Tom, last week, the International Atomic Energy Agency released 2 reports on its ongoing inspections in Iran. It found that Iran has now increased its stockpile of enriched uranium to over 1,000 kilograms, up from the 300 limit, and number of centrifuges to over 6,000. Additionally, Iran has been refusing to allow inspectors to visit certain sites that may have been affiliated with past nuclear research. What are your concerns, and can you put this in context for us?
Thanks, Michelle. I have a lot of concerns, but certainly the main thing this tells us is that Trump's approach is failing, right? I mean, these kind of activities are the kind of things that the Iran deal was designed to prevent and had been preventing very successfully until the moment in 2018 when the Trump administration pulled out of the deal. So here we are going back in a very predictable way to the same challenges that we had before the deal was reached. And we have to ask the question, what were they thinking? Did they not see that this was going to happen? This was very predictable. We all saw this coming. And here we are. So the administration has pulled out of this deal that was working with really no plan to get us in a better place. Iran is now closer to a bomb. They say they're not going for a bomb, but certainly if they were to go to a bomb, they're closer now than they were before. The breakout time used to be about a year. Now, some people say about 6 months. So that's a significant difference, and that's not an improvement from where we were before. So, I would say the Trump administration is moving us closer to war with Iran. Not that war is an answer to this situation in any way, but certainly the pressure for military action will increase, even though that will be a disaster. Maximum pressure has failed. Now, this can be reversed. We can move this back if there are negotiations, if there's diplomacy. But I don't see any hope that the Trump administration can do that, right? I mean, after the military action that Trump took against Iran and Soleimani and the damage that did to diplomacy, I don't see them getting back to the table. And so we just have to hope that Iran continues to self-contain itself until November, and we see what happens.
Finally, the COVID-19 crisis is starting to penetrate even our nuclear policy world. Iran is trying to mitigate a massive outbreak. Speaking of Iran, over 7,000 infected and 237 dead. North Korea has evacuated foreign diplomats from its capital. We're not public health experts. We're not going to tell you to listen to us except for 2 things. One, Akshai, we were talking about this. People need to check their sources.
Absolutely, Michelle. So according to the Washington Post last week, the Russians are spreading misinformation about coronavirus online. And so we really caution our listeners to make sure that they verify their sources before they take preventive measures.
We recommend following the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the World Health Organization, and those experts who have worked in public health, epidemiology, and biosecurity.
Some Twitter accounts are better than others.
And on the Better Than Others, Beth Cameron over at Nuclear Threat Initiative has a great Twitter presence. With that, our time is up. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks
Thank
for
you,
having
Michelle.
us.
We're here in the San Francisco offices of the Ploughshares Fund with Pam Hamamoto, who served as the permanent representative of the United States to the United Nations and other international organizations in Geneva from 2014 to 2017. Ambassador Hamamoto is also a board member of Ploughshares Fund. Thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
I'm also joined by Michelle Dover.
And it is a pleasure, as always, to be here.
Well, thank you. We're here to make an important announcement. Pam?
Yeah, well, thank you for the opportunity. First of all, I've been enjoying this podcast for the last few months, so I'm excited to finally be on this side of the microphone.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's fun. So what I wanted to announce today is Ploughshares Fund's new $1 million Women's Initiative campaign. What we're trying to do is to raise funds specifically to support women-led initiatives, really to address this age-old problem of women being severely underrepresented in all the important discussions in the decision-making that goes on throughout the field, this field as well as many others, and really to support the women's initiative that Ploughshares launched a couple of years ago with some specific funding that can really amplify and accelerate their work.
Yes, we've already made grants related to this. You've seen some of our programmatic efforts as well. Last year, we held a request for proposals where we gave $60,000 towards new projects by people who had never received grants from Ploughshares before.
Yeah, this is really one of the fun parts of the job, be able to find really good, smart people out there and then give them some of the resources they need to do what they do. But I wanted to go back a bit with you, Pam, to talk about your origins in this issue and how you inspired us to get this going. Do you mind if I start with how we met?
Not at all.
I was with Michael Douglas in Geneva a few years ago, and we were working to try to increase cooperation among the NGOs who are working in that space. And I had heard about you and reached out to you, and we were fortunate enough to find you in Geneva on a quiet evening, and you invited us to your very impressive home on the lake. Is it on the lake?
It was on Lake Geneva.
On the lake, and you were kind enough to host us for dinner.
Honestly, Joe, it was one of the highlights of my 3-year stint in Geneva.
Oh, I don't think having dinner with me was really that.
Both of you.
Michael was
both
great.
of you brought.
It really is something when Michael Douglas walks through your door, isn't it?
It was wonderful for a lot of reasons. Obviously, I've been a big fan of his for a long time. But really, one of the most impressive things about that evening was just having a conversation over dinner with both of you about your work with Ploughshares Fund and your thoughtful conviction and engagement to this issue, and really educating me on the work that you had done and how this existential threat really doesn't get the kind of attention that it deserves, that it really should get, it really helped me hone in on how I wanted to spend my time when I got back here, following my time in Geneva, and really engage on this issue and see what I could, bring to the table, bring to these discussions, and try to further the cause.
While we're there, you also shed light for us on the issues you were working with, which also don't get enough attention, because you there were known as a champion for gender equity, and had started several successful initiatives that you told us about them, most notably the Future She Deserves and International Gender Champions. Can you tell us a little bit about those? Yeah,
no, absolutely. So, it goes back to one of the first meetings I had when I arrived in Geneva. And I was asked by President Obama to serve as ambassador to the United Nations in Geneva, which is the United States' largest overseas multilateral diplomatic post. And what that means is that it engages with the UN system on a wide diversity of issues, ranging from humanitarian affairs to global health, to climate change, to trade, sustainable development, internet governance. The list kind of goes on and on. So it's a very broad and diverse portfolio. And I had the pleasure, I was still wet behind the ears, and Kofi Annan invited me to have lunch with him.
The UN
Oh my goodness.
Secretary General.
Exactly. And I'll never forget, he gave me 2 pieces of advice that really guided my engagement for the 3 years that I was there. The first thing he told me was, coming in as the U.S. ambassador, I had this incredible, powerful platform that had been turned over to me, and to really be thoughtful and use it wisely and to use it responsibly. And it was all about sort of the attitude you brought to the job, how I was going to choose to engage with people. And when I coming from somebody like Kofi and having watched his diplomatic engagement over the years and how he has been such a remarkable global leader, that was such an inspiration to me, and it really shaped my engagement while I was there in that multicultural, multilateral arena. And then the second thing he said was, it would be easy to spend the time just responding to all the various issues and crises of the day and kind of get pulled in a lot of different directions. But to really think from the beginning up front about what kind of a legacy did I want to leave when I look back. We all know that these positions are fleeting. They only lasted, a few years. And so to be mindful of how I was using my time and to think strategically from the start about what would you like to look back and say that this is something that I was able to accomplish while I was here.
Good advice.
And it's hard when you're just sort of sitting in the chair for a relatively short period of time. And so for me, it really boiled down pretty quickly to gender equality and women's empowerment, and how did I want to try to make a difference in the lives of women and girls around the world. I noticed, I sort of at the top of this podcast talked about the long list of issues that the UN organizations deal with. And the one common theme that runs through all of them is gender inequality, how women and girls are disproportionately, vulnerable and devalued, and that we really needed to focus on raising their voices and providing more protections and looking for ways to bring the whole international community together around this. So I launched an initiative called The Future She Deserves, which was built on 4 key pillars: gender-based violence, adolescent girls' health, the economic empowerment of women, and women's leadership. And we really tried to unite the community around these issues.
And who are you working with? These are the good principles, but what are you actually doing?
So I'm working with heads of all the 100+ international organizations that are in this Geneva ecosystem.
And as U.S. ambassador, when
as
you
the
call,
U.S. ambassador,
they answer. You're using your position to push these issues.
Exactly. And I was able to build great relationships with people, at the top of these organizations, but really throughout these organizations. And then with my counterparts, diplomats from around the world, leaders that had been engaged in these different issues, many of them throughout their entire careers, but really hadn't engaged in a way that was as collaborative, I would say. And really, where I was pushing them was, you need to make a personal commitment. You're a global leader. What you do matters, and if we can come together, which we did in the International Gender Champions Initiative, to build a leadership network.
And so tell me what that is.
So International Gender Champions, I co-founded with Michael Mueller, who was the Director General of the United Nations office in Geneva. And we worked very closely on this, together on this to really bring our colleagues together with us. And this was fellow diplomats, heads of international organizations, heads of NGOs, private sector leaders, starting in Geneva, but let's all come together with concrete commitments of what are we going to do in the coming year to advance gender equality, either in our organizations or through our programmatic work.
So commitments like what?
Oh gosh, commitments like how they were going to better support women in their organizations, how they were going to engage globally. For instance, Peter Maurer, the head of the Red Cross, one of his early commitments was, as he traveled around the world to various, conflict areas and areas with terrible, humanitarian crises going on, that he was going to make an effort everywhere he went to meet with at least one women's group and hear directly from them, what are the issues they're dealing with? Where are they being underserved?
So be intentional about this.
Very intentional and really commit to something you're going to hope to achieve in the coming year.
And did you hold them accountable for their commitments?
We held them accountable. Obviously there was no legal framework, but it was really peer accountability. And it was saying, and the one thing I remember saying when I launched the initiative was, we welcome everybody. We want people that are just ready to take baby steps, and we want people that are ready to take bold steps. And wherever you are, we want you here with us. Join us, and together we'll all move the ball forward. So that at least we're going in the right direction.
And is this still going?
Still going.
In Geneva?
Well, we've expanded beyond Geneva. So we started in Geneva, where Michael and I were headquartered. And then we really thought we needed to grow this. It really became kind of a movement. And we now have hubs in New York, Vienna, Paris, The Hague, Nairobi, basically all the UN hubs where there's multilateral engagement. We have currently over 250 gender champions who have made these personal commitments, and about 150 alumni champions who are still actively engaged, moving forward. And we've had over 1,000 of these personal commitments, most of which have been met either fully or partially, and are really driving progress, real tangible progress.
Fabulous. Is that where you met Laura Holgate, by the way?
So that's how I met Laura when she had moved to Vienna, and we had started conversations about starting the Vienna hub.
So you and she cooperated on that.
So we started cooperating, and then she ended up moving back to the U.S. before that hub was launched. But that all sort of translated into the Gender Champions in Nuclear Policy initiative, which Michelle has been intimately involved with and can talk about.
Well, and this idea that, it's not just, you don't make change just from the bottom up, but you really need leadership commitments to have that change within an organization, that top down. I mean, that's what really drove this. And we were just so inspired by it. I'll never forget our first conversation of, how do we go about asking the folks in Geneva who really drove this if we can take this model and bring it to the nuclear policy community, where we just felt that there was this same desire of, Joe, as you put it, it's like, what's the actual thing that we can do? And we just thought this was just an amazing way to be able to give people that framework that they can see how they can make change.
Right, and you were our inspiration for this. So when we were interested in recruiting you to the Ploughshares Fund board, when you came back from Geneva, we went and had a cup of coffee with you, Liz Warner and I, in the coffee shop in the Presidio,
right,
I think.
Exactly.
And when you started talking about this, light bulbs went off for us.
Well, the women's initiative that you all had launched a year or so before I even joined the board was truly an inspiration. And one of the big reasons that I said, this needs to be something that I commit some of my time and energy to. You're really changing the field. You've in a short period of time already.
Just about a year.
There's already been, incredible progress. This field, everybody knows, is, way behind the curve and needs to really do everything it can to bring more women to the table. We need women, to be sharing their perspectives and their expertise and
we're lucky
broadening
enough-
the conversations.
Absolutely. We were lucky enough to get Laura Holgate to agree to take it on. She's the head of the project based at the Nuclear Threat Initiative.
I know, we're up to 49. Just think your organization, you could be number 50.
You could be number
Call
50.
us. We're here.
So just briefly, tell us what it means to be a gender champion for nuclear policy.
It means you're the head of an organization where you consider yourself a part of the nuclear policy field. You commit to try to avoid being on single gender panels. You commit to tracking all of your appearances, and you take 3 additional pledges for your organization and how you are going to advance gender equality that year. You report out on what it is. You have access to an amazing network of people who are all trying to, as Pam said, move that ball forward.
Right. So, for example, I'm a gender champion, and I agree not to be in a mantle. So
Yes.
I've turned things down and to suggest women who could take my place and probably
Exactly.
be
There's
better
this
than me.
great set of questions that you can use
I've
to
also
help
committed
those
when
panels.
I'm interviewed for an article. I suggest a woman expert that could be included, so we can end the scourge of marticles. Quote only
Yes.
men.
Thank you, Alex Bell and Kelsey Davenport.
For calling that out years ago. And as when we also put our money where our mouth is, we committed to making sure that half of our grants go to women or women-led projects. How are we doing in that, by the way?
We are at 50%. We reached parity last year, and we're on
Excellent.
track to do so again this year.
And as to who is and some of the newer members of Gender Champions, very interesting.
Yeah, we were really excited. I mean, MacArthur Foundation has joined, a recent one. We were just
Big.
thrilled. And we have 2 national labs, Los Alamos National Laboratory and Idaho National Laboratory. And we have NEI, we have industry organizations. And this is in addition to our, fellow NGOs. Like Win Without War, Arms Control Association, Wisconsin Project. It's just really been an incredible experience.
So this is one of the major accomplishments of the Women's Initiative. I mean, this didn't exist a few years ago. We started the Women's Initiative to increase the role and voices of women in nuclear security. It's led to things like this, but it's more than this, and it also includes the grants. It includes networking that we're doing. So what do you hope to do, Pam? You're the co-chair of the initiative campaign.
Yep,
right now? Who's your other co-chair?
I recently signed on to co-chair the $1 Million Campaign Initiative with Tabitha Jordan, another board member, and she and I are going to work to really try to bring more attention to the initiative, to bring more resources to the initiative, to help people really understand how they can get involved and where they can make a difference, why it's important that they make a difference. The one thing with the Gender Champions work that we've all been doing is we've been talking about the need for sort of this top-down commitment, the leadership, the gender champions. But in reality, this sort of trickle-down effect is so powerful. And one thing I noticed is that when the leader of the organization is committed, it empowers everybody throughout the organization, middle management, people all the way down to, the gender focal points who sadly, for a long time, they were sort of tucked away somewhere and really fighting to be heard. And now they've got a direct line to the heads of these organizations. It's not only okay for them to talk about gender equality and bringing more opportunities for women, but it's expected now. So the whole conversation has changed.
One of the things, I can't remember who told me this, but it's really stayed with me, is that you can't expect or ask the people who work for you to be more brave than you are.
Right.
And so when you think about what your organization is able to accomplish, this is what it means to be the leader. You have to put yourself that far out there and know that your staff is likely to follow you there. And you can't ask them to lead that charge if you're not willing to be there.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So let me ask you something. Your history with International Gender Champions and the Future She Deserves explains why this issue attracted you to Ploughshares Fund. But I'm always meant to ask you this. When we asked you to join the board, why did you say yes?
Yeah, well, my connection to the issue around nuclear weapons, nuclear policy, nuclear war goes back really to my childhood. I was born and raised in Hawaii, and my father's a Japanese American who was 10 years old and living in Honolulu when Pearl Harbor was bombed. And as a young Japanese boy, his life was immediately turned upside down. So, I heard about this, throughout my childhood, growing up in Hawaii, in the shadow of Pearl Harbor, and in a very multiracial, multicultural environment. But there was still this history in the Japanese
and your own family history,
bombing of Pearl Harbor, and then Hiroshima. And my own family, actually, my ancestors are from Hiroshima, and so there's just this personal connection that I always felt like, although I wasn't directly engaged in the issue back then, it was something that I was very aware of and felt very connected with.
Yeah,
and so, to have the opportunity to now, engage and try to drive progress and move us toward, a saner nuclear policy and a safer world was really just an opportunity that I wanted to embrace. So thank you for giving it to me.
Well, we're delighted that you're part of this effort, that you're part of the board. And before I leave, just a little bit about how you ended up being ambassador for the United States to Geneva, and does this have any connection to who you played basketball with in Honolulu?
Well,
see, I know who you played basketball with. Do you, Michelle?
I can guess.
I did go to Punahou School with President Obama. Back in the day, he was on the boys' basketball team. I was on the girls' basketball team. We never actually played one-on-one. But so I, had known President Obama for a long time. And I think, we'd lost touch for more than 20 years when he was off, sort of going in his direction and I was going in my direction. But we reconnected when he was running for president. And I think part of the reason why he ended up suggesting that I serve as ambassador to the UN, one was I have a technical background. I have studied engineering, and a lot of the work the UN does is of a more technical nature, which a lot of people don't really focus on. So there was that. I also worked in the investment banking field for about 10 years. And another area of the UN that needs a lot of attention is reform. And so, really making sure that the billions of dollars of funding that we're putting into the UN system is being spent wisely and really pushing for more accountability and transparency.
You have such an inspiring story. And especially at a time where we're seeing some of the opposite from some of our leading appointed officials in State Department posts and UN posts. I think you really represent U.S. policy at its best. What can be done, not just by serving honestly and diligently in the position, but using the position to advance these broader goals that are in U.S. interest, but aren't actually part of U.S. policy, and you make them part of U.S. policy. You transformed your office into this engine for gender equality. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for doing that. I'm inspired just talking to you. But before we end this podcast, I was hoping, Michelle, you could inspire us just a little bit more. So give people some more details on the Women's Initiative and how they might get involved.
If you want to learn more, go to our website, www.ploughshares.org, to read more about some of the great work that has happened under this initiative, as well as provide your support, provide your ideas. I extend an invitation to do so. The other types of projects that it has supported include a virtual reality film led by lovely Amayam called Ways of Knowing, talking about the stories of the Navajo Nation, about uranium mining there. It includes organizing in West Virginia, through WAND. It involves, seeking out these new voices through the Fuller Project, through journalism, through Inkstick Media, a platform for emerging voices in the field. We're always looking for new ways to collaborate. Our most recent collaboration was with the International Center for Research on Women, who's putting forward a feminist foreign policy framework that we talked about with Lyric Thompson, which we are endorsing.
Which is coming out this week, the week this broadcast airs.
That's correct. So please, please, please come to our website, learn more, and join us.
And please consider making a contribution to the Women's Initiative. We want to raise $1 million to fund these projects and many more. And we're flexible. If we raise over $1 million, we'll spend
it. There's so many good ideas out there.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Pam, for taking the time to come and talk to us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I totally echo everything you've said about supporting this initiative. The work that you're doing is incredible. I thought about it a lot. I was in Hiroshima last year, and I was thinking back to President Obama's visit when he said that the work we're doing on nuclear arms requires a moral revolution. And boy, do we need that more than ever today. And so the work you're doing, my hat's off to you. I'm happy to be a part of it. Please support everybody out there. Support the Women's Initiative campaign. Support the efforts of the Ploughshares Fund. And together, we can make this world a safer place. Thank you.
Amen.
Thank you.
Letters, we get letters. We get stacks and stacks of letters.
And now for the segment where I ask Joe a question he has not heard before. Joe, are you ready?
I always get a little nervous, but I'm ready. Let's go.
So today's question is from Nathan, who's from Massachusetts. Nathan asks, as we grapple with the coronavirus spread, I thought it would be interesting to talk about the relationship between bioweapons, which Nathan assures he knows that coronavirus is not a bioweapon.
That's right.
And nuclear weapons. So, do U.S. nuclear weapons currently deter other countries' bioweapons? And if they do, if we change that policy so nukes only deter other nukes, will that leave a deterrence gap? Gap in quotes.
Very interesting question. Okay, this is tough because these are exactly the questions that go into whether the United States should have a no first use policy for nuclear weapons, whether it should have a sole use policy for nuclear weapons. We're very close to this. Under the Obama administration, when they did the nuclear posture review, they tried to narrow it down. And what they came up with was a formulation that said the fundamental purpose of U.S. nuclear weapons is to deter a nuclear attack. But it left the door open. And when the Trump administration came in, of course, they pushed open that door and included a whole bunch of other things in there, including the standard concern that we need this to respond to a biological or chemical attack. Okay, so this goes back to the invention of bioweapons and chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, the weapons of mass destruction that came up in the 20th century. There's nothing new about mass destruction. Human beings have been killing other human beings in mass numbers since the Israelites invaded Canaan and killed every man, woman, child, sheep, and goat. So what happened in the 20th century was that we mechanized mass destruction. First with chemical weapons that could kill thousands of people. And then with bioweapons, these viruses, toxins, so living organisms that can be spread to kill lots of people. What militaries found out is that neither one of these weapons was particularly militarily useful, so eventually they were willing to give them up. So the U.S. gave up biological weapons, and we had enough toxins and viruses to kill every man, woman, and child in the world in the 1970s. Richard Nixon unilaterally ended the biological weapons program and then went out and negotiated a treaty to ban them. Same with chemical weapons later on by the 1980s, 90s. George H.W. Bush got rid of the U.S. chemical programs and negotiated a treaty to ban them. Now, part of the argument with nuclear weapons is that we still need this, as Nathan says. Suppose we got hit by a bioweapon. Suppose somebody released a virus in New York City that would to kill tens of thousands of people. Well, you don't need nuclear weapons to respond to that for several reasons. One, it's quite possible that you wouldn't know who released the bioweapon. So you have a question of target. What are you going to do? Particularly if it's a terrorist that's doing it. A nuclear weapon does no good against a terrorist that doesn't have a national future or territory to defend. The second is that a nuclear weapon response to a bio or chemical, or I would say even a cyber threat, violates the law of war. That is, your response has to be proportional to the attack. And nuclear weapons are just so much more destructive than any conceivable bioweapon. Finally, we have conventional means for deterring and responding to any attack by a chemical or biological or cyber weapon. We are the most powerful conventional military in the world. We can wreak enormous damage on somebody. And that would be roughly proportional to the kinds of damages you could expect. In sum, Nathan, there hasn't been any empirical evidence that someone's been deterred. That is to say that they were going to attack us with a bioweapon but didn't because we had nuclear weapons. In fact, there's no indication of that at all on any level, cyber, chemical, etc. Even the evidence about nuclear weapons deterring a nuclear attack is a little sketchy, to be honest. So, in short, Nathan, you can rest assured, if someone were to hit us with an unconventional weapon of some type, we have ample conventional means to respond. We don't need nuclear weapons for that purpose.
Another week, another question. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Zender, Alex Spire, and Will Lowry. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Research by Alex Spire. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.